Snow gathered in the corners of the camp like ash after a fire. Thin drifts pressed themselves against the wooden barracks and curled beneath the fences where the wind could not quite reach. The men noticed small things first. The smell of boiled potatoes floating through the yard before dawn, the steam rising from laundry lines behind the kitchens, the strange absence of shouting at night. Keller noticed the door. It stood at the far end of the barracks beneath a weak yellow bulb, scarred with scratches and swollen from winter moisture. Every evening the American guards counted the prisoners twice, nodded to one another, and walked away through the snow. Then, nothing. No bolt sliding shut, no lock turning. The first night, nobody moved for nearly an hour. The silence itself felt dangerous. 40 men sat in the half-dark, listening to the stove crack softly while frost climbed the windows. Some stared at the door. Others avoided looking at it entirely, as though eye contact might trigger whatever trap waited behind it. Weiss finally whispered from the lower bunk, "They forgot." Old Brenner shook his head slowly beneath his blanket. "No one forgets prisoners." That sentence stayed in the room long after the voices disappeared. Keller lay awake, listening to breathing, thin breaths, uneasy breaths, the kind made by men who had survived too much to trust stillness. Somewhere outside, boots crunched across frozen earth. A shadow crossed beneath the gap under the door. The footsteps paused. Every muscle in Keller's body tightened. Then the shadow moved on. Nothing happened. Morning arrived, pale and colourless. Otto, the youngest among them, stood carefully from his bunk and walked toward the entrance, while the others watched in silence. He looked almost embarrassed, as though curiosity itself were dangerous. His fingers touched the handle. He hesitated. Weiss muttered, "Leave it." But Otto opened the door anyway. Cold air spilled into the barracks. Beyond the threshold lay the yard, snow, guard towers, smoke drifting from the kitchens into the grey sky. No rifles raised towards him, no shouting, no alarms. Only the ordinary morning sounds of a camp waking up. Otto closed the door immediately. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Brenner gave a tired little laugh through his nose. "A cage," he murmured, "is most effective when the birds lock themselves inside." Nobody answered him. At breakfast, the prisoners ate slowly from steaming tin bowls, while guards moved among them with quiet efficiency. Keller kept waiting for the performance to collapse. Somewhere, beneath every calm voice, he expected anger. Beneath every ordinary gesture, he expected humiliation waiting to reveal itself. But the guards merely handed out bread. One of them, a broad-shouldered American with tired eyes and snow caught in his scarf, noticed Keller struggling to lift his bowl with his injured arm. "You should keep that wrapped," the guard said in rough German. Keller stared at him. The man pointed toward the shoulder wound beneath Keller's coat. "Infection kills faster than bullets." Then he moved on. Weiss leaned closer across the table. "You see?" he whispered. "That's how they do it." "How?" "They confuse you first." Keller said nothing, because part of him understood exactly what Weiss meant. Cruelty had structure. Cruelty made sense. It divided the world cleanly into guards and prisoners, victors and defeated. But kindness blurred the lines until a man no longer knew where to place his anger. And without anger, something colder began to rise. Shame. That night snow fell harder. Wind rattled the barracks walls while the stove glowed deep orange beside the bunks. Brenner sat near the heat, rubbing his old hands together. "I used to think freedom meant movement," he said quietly. Nobody responded at first. Then Otto asked, "What else could it mean?" Brenner watched the fire for a while before answering. "Sleeping without expecting footsteps." The room became still again. Outside, somewhere beyond the fences, a dog barked once and fell silent. Keller stared toward the unlocked door until his eyes burned with exhaustion. He realized then that none of them feared escape. They feared disappointment. Because if the door truly remained open, if the guards truly saw them as men instead of animals, then the world they had built inside themselves during the war would begin to crack apart. And some things were easier to survive than that. Morning brought fog so thick the watchtowers looked drowned inside it. The prisoners were assigned to clear snow along the outer road leading toward the supply depot. Keller worked beside Weiss in silence while trucks rolled slowly through the whiteness, carrying crates and fuel barrels. The world beyond the fences seemed impossibly normal. A farmer passed on a wagon sometime before noon. 2 children sat beside him, bundled in scarves, staring curiously at the prisoners before disappearing into the mist. Otto watched them go. "I can't remember my sister's face anymore," he said softly. Nobody knew how to answer. The shovels scraped frozen earth, metal against ice, again and again. Later that afternoon, one of the guards slipped while unloading crates near the depot. He crashed hard against the icy ground with a curse, scattering canned food into the snow. Without thinking, Keller stepped forward and helped him stand. For a moment, both men froze. The guard looked startled. So did Keller. War had trained the body too well. Every gesture carried suspicion now. Every instinct needed permission before it could become human again. The guard brushed snow from his coat. "Thanks," he muttered. Keller nodded awkwardly. Weiss watched the exchange with narrowed eyes. That evening, he confronted Keller near the stove while the others pretended not to listen. "You're getting comfortable." It was instinct. That's worse. Keller rubbed tired fingers across his forehead. "What do you want from them?" he asked quietly. "To beat us? At least then we'd understand the rules." The words lingered heavily between them. Brenner looked up from the fire. "Men always prefer familiar misery," he said, "even when freedom is standing in the doorway." Nobody spoke after that. The wind softened overnight. By morning, the camp seemed strangely quiet beneath fresh snow, reflecting weak silver light. Keller woke before dawn and noticed Otto sitting alone beside the entrance, staring at the handle. "You thinking of running?" Keller asked. Otto shook his head. "No." "Then what?" The young man swallowed. "I was wondering why I don't." Keller looked at the door. The answer sat there between them, invisible and enormous. Outside those fences lay uncertainty, hunger, ruins, cities reduced to smoke and memory, families that might no longer exist, a country buried beneath defeat. Inside the camp, there was soup, blankets, predictable mornings. The realization sickened him. Not because the camp was cruel, because it wasn't cruel enough. That afternoon, a truck arrived carrying additional prisoners from another facility farther east. The newcomers stumbled from the back, shivering violently, faces hollow with exhaustion. One older man looked around the camp with open suspicion. "Where are the cells?" he asked. "There aren't any," Otto answered. The man frowned. What do you mean? No locks. Several prisoners laughed bitterly. One spat into the snow. Then you're fools, he muttered. But that night, after evening meal, the newcomers fell silent one by one as they noticed the guards walking away from the barracks without securing the entrance. The room waited. The footsteps faded into darkness. Still no lock. One of the newcomers rose immediately and crossed to the door. He opened it wide, almost angrily, as if determined to expose the trick. Cold air swept through the room. Nothing else happened. The man stood there, staring into the snowy yard, while moonlight spilled across the wooden floorboards. Finally, Brenner spoke from beside the stove. Go on, then. The prisoner turned back slowly. His eyes looked older suddenly. Where would I go? No one answered him, because that was the true prison waiting beneath all the others. Not fences, not guards, not locked doors. The war had hollowed something out inside them long before capture. It had trained them to expect hatred so completely that kindness itself felt suspicious, almost unbearable. And now, faced with ordinary mercy, they no longer knew whether freedom was a road leading outward or simply another room they had forgotten how to enter. Near midnight, Keller rose quietly from his bunk and walked toward the entrance. The others watched without speaking. He placed one hand on the handle, opened the door. The night air struck his face sharp and clean. Snow drifted across the empty yard beneath pale moonlight. Far beyond the fences stood a dark line of trees moving softly in the wind. For a long moment, he simply stood there breathing. Then, slowly, he closed the door again. Not because he was afraid to leave, but because he finally understood that a locked door was sometimes easier to bear than an open one. And in the silence that followed, with the stove whispering faintly behind him, and snow falling endlessly beyond the walls, the barracks no longer felt like a prison alone. It felt like a room full of men, waiting to remember how to become human again.